They said it was just a roof, a job for 10 days, no strings, no complications, just snow, shingles, and silence voice. But from the moment Leo Carter stepped off the old pickup and set his eyes on the ranch buried in the whiteness of Vermont's winter, something shifted. It wasn't the cold that made him pause. It was the way the wind moved through the bare trees, the way the house stood strong but tired, like it had been waiting for someone, like it had been holding its breath. Leo was 32, a solar energy engineer from Boston. He had come out years ago, but the world didn't welcome him with open arms. He had learned to keep his joy small and his presence quieter. Professional, capable, and distant, that was how he stayed safe. This job had been a last-minute contract. Install a solar system for an old ranch house up north. 10 days, one man, a roof no one else wanted to touch. The man who hired him was Gabe Walker, 41, worn denim, work boots, hands that had clearly held both harvest and heartbreak. He didn't smile much, didn't talk much either. Gabe had been a widower for nearly 3 years, raising 5 children alone in the middle of nowhere. Owen, 17, watched Leo with the silent caution of someone who'd been made to grow up too early. Liam, 14, barely looked up from his sketch pad, as if the pencil in his hand was more trustworthy than people. Sadie, 12, stared straight into Leo's eyes with the bluntness only children and grief could master. And Mason and Maddie, the 8-year-old twins, darted through the snow like small storms, laughing one moment, vanishing the next. Leo was shown to a storage room at the back of the house, no insulation, a cot by the wall, and boxes that hadn't been touched since before the funeral. It wasn't a guest room. It wasn't meant to be. The roof above creaked and flaked with rot. The walls whispered drafts like secrets. Leo set his bag down and told himself he could handle it. 10 days, just 10. But when he stepped into the living room to set up his plans, something stopped him cold. On the mantel, above the fireplace, was a photograph. A woman in a lavender sundress stood laughing in the middle of a field, sun in her hair and soil on her hands. Her name, carved softly into the wood frame, was Grace Porter. Leo's chest tightened. He knew that name. He knew that face. Years ago, Grace had been his best friend in college. She had been the one who brought him soup when he was too anxious to eat, the one who sat outside the dean's office with him after he came out and thought the world was ending. The one who, one night under string lights in campus silence, had said, "If I ever have a kid, I hope they meet someone like you." And now here she was, or at least the memory of her, frozen in a photograph, smiling out from a house that no longer said her name aloud. Leo didn't tell Gabe. He didn't say anything to the children. He didn't know how. What do you say when the job you came for suddenly feels like a calling? What do you say when you realize the woman who once saved you left behind a family she never thought you'd meet? He climbed up onto the roof the next morning with his tools in one hand and 1,000 questions in the other. Mo fell quietly as he worked. The shingles cracked like bones, long ignored. And beneath it all, the house seemed to whisper, "You didn't just come here to fix this." He came to fix the roof. But something deeper was already cracking open. If this story touches your heart, stay with us. More of Leo's journey will unfold right here on Heart Story. Subscribe and follow for the next part of this healing story. It was supposed to be a short storm, a few hours, maybe a night, but by morning, the sky had vanished under a ceiling of white, and Leo Carter found himself stranded. The back roads into the Vermont hills were buried. The power flickered like breath in a cold room, and the snow just kept falling. The ranch creaked under the weight. Pipes moaned. Wind clawed at the corners. There would be no returning to Boston, no quiet exit. Leo stayed in the storage room, layered in thermal gear, scribbling solar layouts by flashlight. The system was halfway installed, but now the panels waited in the barn, frozen under tarps. The children moved through the house like ghosts who didn't speak his name. One morning, as Leo helped scoop snow off the porch, Sadie stood in the doorway. arms crossed, jaw tight. "Mom would never let a stranger stay this long," she said, flat and sharp like the cold. Leo didn't answer. She didn't wait. The door closed, and the air between them froze harder than the snow. Inside, Gabe tried to hold the household together. He cooked with quiet focus, managed schoolwork at the kitchen table, chopped wood before dawn, but he didn't speak much, especially not about Grace. Her presence was everywhere, in the handwriting on the old recipe cards, in the stack of folded quilts she once sewed, in the lavender smell that still lingered near the pantry. But no one said her name. Leo watched and remembered. He remembered the way Grace used to draw garden plans in her notebook, dreaming of a life with dirt on her hands and sunlight on her back. He remembered the tiny greenhouse sketches she showed him, always saying, "One day when I grow my own lavender, you're building me the roof." Now, behind the house, barely standing, was a broken structure of wood and glass, a greenhouse, or what used to be. The panes had shattered, the roof sagged. But Liam, quiet, guarded Liam, sat beside it every afternoon, drawing it over and over. So Leo asked nothing, said nothing. He just brought out a new piece of plywood, a roll of sealant tape, a small portable heater, and he knelt in the snow beside the boy and started measuring. The work was slow, the ground unforgiving. But day by day, Liam came closer. First with questions, then with sketches, then with silence that wasn't avoidance, it was shared space. Leo didn't tell anyone about the letter Grace once wrote for him, the one she had handed to the scholarship board without ever mentioning it again. He didn't speak of the night she cried on his shoulder when she felt unseen, or the morning she gave him her gloves and told him, "If you leave school, I'll never forgive you." But those memories sat with him now, heavy like the snow on the barn roof. One night, while cleaning the back closet for storage, Leo found a tattered, spiral-bound notebook tucked behind a box. Grace's handwriting filled the page's notes on canning, ideas for winter soups, sketches of her dream greenhouse. On the last page, nearly faded, was a single line in blue ink. "If Leo has a home, I'll build him a roof, even if it's only on paper." He closed the book, and for the first time in years, his hands trembled. The storm outside kept howling. The power finally went out, but inside the ranch, something had started to thaw. Leo lit the wood stove and gathered the kids in the living room. No one said a word. He handed Sadie a flashlight, told Mason and Maddie to grab their favorite books, gave Owen the matches to light the candles. He didn't ask to be let in, but he stopped standing at the door. The snow had slowed, but the silence in the ranch remained thick. Leo Carter moved through the house like someone trying not to leave fingerprints. He fixed what he could. He shoveled, swept, and patched. But the place wasn't asking for repairs. It was asking for someone to remember it right. He hadn't spoken Grace's name aloud since he arrived. Not once, but she was everywhere. While checking wiring in the attic one afternoon, Leo noticed a narrow gap behind an old cabinet. Dust clung to the floorboards, but something metal caught the light tucked deep in the shadows. He reached in. It was a small, rusted tin box. On the top, faded but unmistakable, was his name, Leo, written in Grace's handwriting. His fingers hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter, dated November 2010, addressed to the Office of Academic Affairs, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Grace had written it when Leo was on the brink of giving up. His scholarship had run out. His part-time job couldn't cover rent. He had told her he was going to leave, that school wasn't meant for people like him. But he hadn't known she wrote a letter behind his back, a letter that pleaded not with pity, but with power. She had written about his brilliance, his heart, his work ethic. She had called him the kind of mind this country should never waste. He had stayed at MIT. Somehow, an anonymous grant had appeared just in time. He'd thought it was luck. It wasn't. Grace had done it and never told him. Leo sat there in the attic, the paper trembling in his hands, and all the years between then and now folded into a breath he couldn't release. Later that day, when the clouds cleared for a while, Leo walked out to the broken greenhouse. Liam was already there. He didn't speak, just handed Leo a drawing, an aerial view of the house. The trees, the lavender beds. Leo studied the lines. They were clean, careful, full of longing. He pointed at the sketch of the greenhouse and asked gently, "May I want to come?" Together, they began fixing the frame. Leo taught Liam how to reinforce the roof angle so it wouldn't collapse again. They replaced the glass panels one by one, sealing each joint against the bitter wind. Inside, Sadie sat by the window and watched. That night, Leo cooked dinner, Grace's roasted root vegetable stew, from her notebook. The scent of thyme and garlic drifted through the house like a memory too old to name. He didn't ask for help, but Owen joined to slice the carrots. Maddie set the table. Mason folded the napkins. Sadie lingered in the hallway, then finally walked in and adjusted the salt. They ate in quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't push people out, but leaves room for them to arrive. Afterward, Leo walked outside and stood by the main roof again. Not as a contractor, not as a guest, but as someone who had once been saved by the woman whose voice still lived in these walls. And for the first time, he wasn't just remembering Grace. He was continuing what she started. Leo stood before the house, no longer the roofer. He was the one Grace had trusted to rebuild what she had left behind. The second storm didn't come with warning. The radio had mentioned flurries, a light snow, nothing more. But by nightfall, the wind screamed louder than before and the cold sank deeper into the wood. Leo Carter was in the barn, checking the solar battery casing. When he heard the crack, it wasn't sharp, it was hollow, like a rib snapping under weight. He ran outside. The wind burned his face as he reached the back pasture and froze. The roof of the old animal shed had caved in. Snow, ice, and rotted beams spilled down like a broken spine. He heard it then. A cry, small, trapped. Maddie. Leo didn't hesitate. He dropped his gloves, tore off his jacket, and crawled into the wreckage. The wood groaned. Snow poured through the gaps. He could barely see, but then a flash of purple. Maddie's mitten. She was wedged beneath a crossbeam, legs twisted awkwardly, eyes wide with panic, but no scream left in her lungs. Leo moved without thought. He braced the beam with his shoulder, dug through the snow with bare hands, and pulled until his arm burned. He didn't stop. He lifted her out and shoved her toward the light. A second later, the beam snapped down and caught Leo across the forearm. He didn't scream. He bit it back. By the time Gabe returned from town with supplies, Maddie was inside by the fire, wrapped in blankets. Leo sat beside her, his arms swollen and darkening, face pale but calm. Sadie was the first to move. She walked up silently, a small tin of salve in hand. She didn't speak, just unwrapped the bandage Owen had hastily tied and began to clean the wound. Leo didn't flinch. Owen stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes fixed. Then he said softly, almost like talking to no one, "If Mom saw you today, she'd be proud." Later that night, the house was quiet again, but something had shifted. Gabe knocked on Leo's door, not the storage room, but the kitchen, where Leo had fallen asleep on the bench with a warm compress on his arm. He sat down across from him, opened a folded paper, and pushed it gently toward Leo. It was the letter, the one Grace had written over a decade ago, the one Leo had left on Gabe's nightstand earlier that evening. Gabe's eyes were red, his voice rough. "I didn't know she wrote this," he said. "She knew I'd fall apart, and she believed you'd be the one strong enough to show up when I did." There was no answer needed, because this wasn't about replacing Grace or about repairing what was lost. This was about becoming what was needed without asking to be asked. Outside, the wind finally quieted. The moon laid soft light across the fields, and the fences stood unbroken. Inside, the children slept. Mason curled up with a blanket Leo had stitched earlier that week. Liam's sketch of the greenhouse rested on the mantel. no longer hidden. And Leo, with his arm wrapped tight and his heart split open, sat in the kitchen of a house that was no longer a job site. The storm had passed, but something more important had fallen. The wall that once kept him a stranger had finally come down. 1 month passed. The snow had begun to melt. Not completely, but just enough for the earth to show through in scattered patches. The roof was solid now. The panels hummed quietly with the winter sun. The barn stood taller. The greenhouse glimmered with new glass. But the most noticeable change wasn't in the buildings, it was inside the house. Leo Carter had stopped sleeping in the storage room weeks ago. No one had said anything. But one morning, Mason had dragged a pillow into the living room and muttered, "Uncle Leo should have a real bed." And that was that. Sadie gave him a folded sheet of paper during breakfast one Sunday. It was a drawing her style bold, the lines confident. The title in all caps, "Uncle Leo Saves the Day." There he was, in her sketch, standing in the snow, holding Maddie's hand beneath a falling roof. His nose was too big, his eyes a little crooked, but his heart was drawn bright red, radiating lines like sunbeams. That same week, Liam came home from school with a slip of paper, a printed essay. His teacher had selected it for the school bulletin. The title read, "The Man Who Fixed More Than Just the Roof." Leo read it silently, his throat tightening at every line. He didn't come to save us, but he did. Not by being loud, but by listening. Not by telling us who to be, but by letting us remember who we were when Mom was still here. That night, Leo stood alone in the garden behind the greenhouse. The snow had melted just enough for the lavender beds to breathe again. He kneeled down to clear the dead branches. As he did, his hand brushed something hard. It was a small stone plaque, half buried in soil and frost. He wiped it clean. Grace's handwriting was etched into the stone, faded but unmistakable. For those who stay, not just those who pass. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of her, of them, of everything that hadn't been said but had now been lived. Gabe joined him in the garden the next morning, carrying a folded tarp and an old measuring tape. He didn't speak right away, but when he did, his voice was steady. "If you're ready to leave, we'll understand. But if you want to stay..." He paused. "We thought the storage room could be your studio. The kids already cleared it out." Leo looked at the house, the windows still fogged from the heat inside. The sound of Mason and Maddie laughing somewhere down the hallway. The kitchen light glowing just like it had in that photo of Grace with soil on her hands. He wasn't a father, he wasn't a husband, he wasn't family by blood, but he had been chosen. Not by biology, but by trust. Not because he arrived, but because he stayed. And for once, he didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. He came to fix the roof. But what he rebuilt was a family. What does family mean to you, those we're born into, or those who choose to stay? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved your heart, follow our journey and subscribe to Heart Story, where every story finds a home.